Between 1985 and 2013, the United States sentenced several military men to death, soldiers who turned against their own, leaving trails of blood within the ranks and beyond. In this video, we uncover their crimes, trials, last meals, and the final words that echoed in silence. This is Sin, Crime, and Silence Records. Hassan Kareem Akbar. State of execution, military, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, Fort Leavenworth. On March 23, 2003, as the United States military prepared to launch the ground invasion of Iraq, a betrayal from within shook the armed forces to its core. Army Sergeant Hassan Kareem Akbar, assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, carried out a calculated and deadly attack, not against foreign combatants, but against his own unit. His actions led to the deaths of 2 officers and injuries to 14 other service members in one of the most devastating acts of internal military violence in modern U.S. history. The attack occurred at Camp Pennsylvania, a forward staging area in the Kuwaiti desert, just hours before the 101st was scheduled to move into Iraq. The betrayal wasn't spontaneous. It was premeditated, deeply personal, and recorded in Akbar's own words. In the early morning hours, while his fellow soldiers slept inside their tents, Akbar executed his plan. Armed with 4 hand grenades and an M4 rifle, he moved through the darkness. He pulled the pins from the grenades and tossed them into tents occupied by officers. The explosions shattered the pre-dawn silence, followed by the staccato bursts of gunfire. Akbar fired indiscriminately, targeting those who tried to flee or respond. The chaos was immediate and disorienting. Some believed it was an enemy attack. But within moments, the horrifying truth became clear. The shooter was one of their own. The attack killed Army Captain Christopher S. Seifert, 27, and Air Force Major Gregory L. Stone, 40. Both were struck down by someone they were supposed to trust. 14 other soldiers sustained injuries, some with life-altering consequences, both physical and emotional. It was the first known case of fratricide in the U.S. military during the War on Terror. Akbar was apprehended quickly after the assault. Soldiers found him hiding with a rifle still in his possession and injuries consistent with a grenade detonation. In his tent, military police discovered a personal diary, a chilling artifact that revealed the calculated nature of the crime. "I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible," he had written. His entries detailed long-simmering anger and resentment toward fellow soldiers. He felt alienated, disrespected, and marginalized, particularly by white officers. His writings revealed he believed they were conspiring against him and that his faith as a Muslim made him a target of ridicule and exclusion. What investigators uncovered wasn't a sudden break. It was the culmination of personal isolation, perceived injustice, and extremist thought, forming a cocktail of rage that ultimately erupted into violence. In April 2005, Hassan Kareem Akbar was tried by military court-martial at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He was charged with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 14 counts of attempted premeditated murder under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ. The prosecution presented powerful evidence: physical forensics, eyewitness accounts, and Akbar's own diary. The defense did not deny that Akbar committed the acts but attempted to raise questions about his mental health and psychological history, suggesting schizophrenia and paranoia. They argued that Akbar had long struggled with feelings of persecution and delusion. But the panel, a jury of Army officers, was unconvinced. After a 2-week trial and nearly 8 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Akbar was sentenced to death, becoming the first American soldier since the Vietnam War to receive the death penalty for killing fellow troops during wartime. Akbar was transferred to the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he remains on military death row. Like all military executions, his sentence cannot be carried out without final approval from the President of the United States, a requirement that remains pending. His mental health has continued to be a point of contention during the appeals process. His defense has argued that Akbar suffers from long-standing psychological disorders that were inadequately treated or understood. However, multiple courts and military review boards have upheld both his conviction and his sentence, concluding that he was legally sane at the time of the crime and fully responsible for his actions. Hassan Kareem Akbar has issued no final statement, as his execution has not been scheduled. His actions have left a deep scar in the memory of the U.S. military community. The names Christopher Seifert and Gregory Stone are remembered not just as casualties of war, but as victims of betrayal. The attack at Camp Pennsylvania stands as a chilling reminder of the complex intersections of mental health, military culture, isolation, faith, and rage. The war moved on. Troops crossed into Iraq that same week. But for the families of the fallen, and for those wounded that night, March 23, 2003, never ended. Akbar's name is now often cited in military and legal discussions surrounding internal threats, psychological screening, and the handling of soldiers struggling with identity, faith, and alienation. His case remains a benchmark in military justice, a rare instance where the full machinery of capital punishment under military law was activated and remains in motion. Ronald Adrien Gray. State of execution, military, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, Fort Leavenworth. Between April 1986 and January 1987, Army Specialist Ronald Adrien Gray, stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, committed a series of brutal rapes and murders that terrorized both the military community and surrounding civilian neighborhoods. His crimes, committed against both civilians and military personnel, marked him as one of the most violent serial offenders ever tried under military law. Gray targeted women with calculated violence. His methods combined opportunism, coercion, and extreme brutality, leaving a trail of forensic evidence and trauma behind. The scope and savagery of his acts would lead to a rare outcome in American military justice, a death sentence approved by a sitting president. Gray's killing spree began in the spring of 1986, with attacks carried out both on and off military grounds. His victims were not random, they were women who crossed his path through work, chance, or proximity. His assaults involved rape, physical assault, abduction, and cold-blooded murder, often using weapons stolen from military sources. His first known victim was Linda Jean Coates, found raped and murdered in her apartment near Fort Bragg in April 1986. Over the following months, Gray continued attacking women, often luring them under false pretenses before overpowering them. He used his military training, physical strength, and knowledge of the local area to stalk, isolate, and kill. One of the most high-profile victims was Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, a fellow service member. She was abducted, raped, and fatally shot. Gray left her body in a wooded area near the base. The murder of Tammy Kofer Wilson followed a similar pattern, involving sexual assault, abduction, and execution-style shooting. In January 1987, Gray called a cab and was picked up by Kimberly Ann Ruggles, a 23-year-old civilian driver. He abducted, raped, and murdered her, dumping her body in a wooded area. This final known murder would mark the beginning of Gray's unraveling. One woman, Private Mary Ann Lang Namath, survived Gray's attempt on her life. She was raped, stabbed multiple times, and left for dead, but miraculously survived and provided critical testimony. Her detailed description of Gray, along with his fingerprints and forensic evidence found on her body and at the crime scene, tied him definitively to the attack. Namath's survival and bravery in testifying would become central to Gray's prosecution and ultimate conviction. Law enforcement and military investigators compiled overwhelming forensic evidence linking Gray to the crimes. This included fingerprints found on multiple victims and crime scenes, DNA evidence confirming sexual contact, stolen military-issued weapons used in the killings, victim belongings discovered in Gray's possession, survivor eyewitness testimony. When confronted, Gray confessed to some of the crimes and cooperated to a limited extent, but the bulk of the case was built on hard evidence. Authorities quickly determined they were dealing with a serial predator operating within the military ranks. Gray was first tried in North Carolina civilian court, where he pleaded guilty to several charges, including rape and murder. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, due to the nature of the crimes and his active duty status, the U.S. Army also court-martialed Gray, seeking the death penalty under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ. In 1988, after a comprehensive court-martial, Gray was convicted of 2 counts of premeditated murder, 3 counts of rape, and multiple counts of attempted murder and assault. He was sentenced to death by the military tribunal. This created a rare situation, a dual-track conviction where the civilian system sentenced him to life, and the military pursued capital punishment. In 2008, President George W. Bush formally approved Gray's military death sentence, the first such presidential approval in over 50 years. This step cleared the way for execution, but Gray's legal team filed appeals in both military and civilian federal courts, arguing procedural errors and constitutional violations. Despite multiple federal appeals, courts have upheld the conviction and sentence. However, his execution has been repeatedly delayed, primarily due to the complex intersection of military and civilian legal processes. As of now, no date for execution has been scheduled. Ronald Adrien Gray is currently incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on military death row. He has now spent over 3 decades in custody, awaiting the final step in the military execution process. If carried out, his execution would be the first military execution since 1961, when Army Private John Bennett was hanged. Gray has made no public final statement. His case remains one of the most notorious examples of military serial homicide in U.S. history, and it stands as a stark reminder of the capacity for violence that can exist within the ranks. For the families of Linda Jean Coates, Tammy Kofor Wilson, Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, and Kimberly Ann Ruggles, justice has moved slowly. For Private Namath, who lived to tell her story, the trial and conviction were both victory and trauma. The name Ronald Adrien Gray is now cited in discussions of military capital punishment, serial violence within the armed forces, and the challenges of navigating dual jurisdiction in cases involving service members. His case stands as a precedent, both for the military's capacity to pursue the death penalty and for the system's enduring delays in delivering it. Timothy B. Hennis. State of execution, military, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, Fort Leavenworth. Between May 1985 and April 2010, the case of Army Master Sergeant Timothy B. Hennis became one of the most extraordinary legal sagas in U.S. military and criminal justice history. A case that spanned decades, saw multiple trials, and culminated in a rare reassertion of military jurisdiction for a capital offense. Hennis was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, when the brutal triple murder that would change his life, and end 3 others, occurred in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Summerhill Road, Fayetteville. In May 1985, the peace of a North Carolina military community was shattered. The bodies of Catherine Eastburn, age 31, and her 2 young daughters, 5-year-old Kara and 3-year-old Erin, were discovered in their home. The scene was savage and deeply disturbing. All 3 victims had been stabbed repeatedly. Catherine had also been sexually assaulted. Only the youngest child, 22-month-old Jana, was found alive, dehydrated and alone, but otherwise unharmed. She had been left in her crib for days with no care following the murders. The horror was compounded by the detail that just days earlier, Catherine Eastburn had given the family dog away to a man she had met through a classified ad. That man was Timothy Hennis. Hennis quickly became a suspect. He had taken the Eastburns' dog, and eyewitnesses placed a man resembling him near the home during the estimated time of the murders. Physical evidence at the time was limited. Still, prosecutors believed they had built a compelling circumstantial case based on Hennis's proximity, behavior, and opportunity. A jury convicted him in 1986, and he was sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. Hennis appealed. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the conviction, citing prejudicial photographs shown during trial that may have unduly influenced the jury. A retrial followed in 1989. This time, the defense pushed back hard against the prosecution's circumstantial narrative. They highlighted the lack of direct physical evidence and stressed alternative possibilities. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of not guilty. Hennis was acquitted and returned to the Army, where he rebuilt his life and rose through the ranks, eventually retiring honorably. For many, that seemed to close the case, until science reopened it. In 2006, over 2 decades after the murders, new DNA testing was conducted on evidence collected during the original investigation. Biological material recovered from Catherine Eastburn's body, preserved in evidence storage, was tested using advanced techniques not available in the 1980s. The results came back with a match to Timothy Hennis. But double jeopardy laws barred a new trial in civilian court. Hennis had already been acquitted in that system. However, because Hennis was still technically under military jurisdiction due to his prior service, the U.S. Army recalled him to active duty in 2006, a legal maneuver that allowed them to retry him under military law. In 2010, he faced a 3rd trial, this time before a military court-martial at Fort Bragg. The evidence, particularly the DNA match, proved decisive. Though Hennis maintained his innocence and his defense challenged the chain of custody and interpretation of the DNA, the jury found him guilty. He was again sentenced to death. Timothy B. Hennis is currently incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He remains one of the few individuals on military death row. Like all military executions, his sentence requires final approval from the President of the United States, a step that has not yet occurred. The case continues to spark debate across legal and military communities. The legal uniqueness of recalling a retired soldier for the purpose of capital prosecution is rare, raising constitutional questions that have been argued in various courts. Nonetheless, multiple federal courts have upheld the conviction and the military's authority to prosecute. Timothy Hennis has not been executed, and he has issued no final statement. His execution is pending indefinite presidential approval. He remains alive on military death row, his name forever linked to one of the most complex, chilling, and debated cases in American legal history. For the families of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn, justice was a journey that took 25 years. For Jana Eastburn, the baby left alive in her crib. Memories were never formed, but the legacy of that night defines her origin. And for the military and legal systems that handled this case, Timothy B. Hennis remains a precedent, not just of brutality, but of the enduring, evolving reach of justice. Nidal Malik Hasan. State of execution, military, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, Fort Leavenworth. On November 5, 2009, Army Major Nidal Malik Hasan, a psychiatrist tasked with caring for soldiers returning from war, turned his weapon on them in one of the deadliest mass shootings on a U.S. military installation. At the Soldier Readiness Processing Center on Fort Hood, Texas, where troops underwent final medical checks before deployment, Hasan opened fire in a calculated act of internal terrorism that left 13 dead and over 30 wounded. The massacre stunned the nation, not only for its scale and setting but for the identity of the shooter. A U.S. Army officer, educated, trusted, and in uniform, who claimed he was acting in defense of Islam. His actions would spark a fierce national debate over radicalization, military screening, religious extremism, and domestic security. Shortly after 1:30 p.m., the routine atmosphere at the Readiness Center dissolved into panic. Soldiers waiting to process paperwork and vaccinations were ambushed by a man armed with a FN-57 semi-automatic pistol and a .357 Magnum revolver. Witnesses reported that Hasan stood up, shouted "Allahu Akbar," Arabic for God is great, and began firing into the crowd. He targeted unarmed personnel, moving through the building with deadly precision, shooting at soldiers and civilians alike. In a span of minutes, 13 people were killed, including a pregnant soldier. Over 30 others were wounded, some critically. Several survivors later reported playing dead, crawling to safety, or shielding others with their bodies. Chaos reigned until civilian police officer Sergeant Kimberly Munley engaged Hasan in a firefight, along with her partner Sergeant Mark Todd. Hasan was shot multiple times and taken into custody, paralyzed from the waist down. As investigators delved into Hasan's background, a chilling portrait emerged. Born in Virginia to Palestinian immigrant parents, Hasan had earned his medical degree and rose through the military ranks as a psychiatrist. But beneath the surface, signs of radicalization had long been visible. Hasan had communicated via email with Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S.-born radical cleric later killed in a drone strike due to his terrorist activities. In these emails, Hasan asked detailed questions about martyrdom, jihad, and the killing of U.S. soldiers. Despite being flagged by the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, no decisive action was taken before the attack. Evidence revealed that Hasan saw himself as a soldier of Allah. He viewed his impending deployment to Afghanistan as a betrayal of his faith. In his mind, he was taking a stand in what he perceived as a war between Islam and the West. His rampage, he would later admit, was an act of war. In 2013, after years of legal motions and pre-trial hearings, Nidal Hasan went to trial. He chose to represent himself, firing his legal team and refusing to mount a traditional defense. He did not cross-examine witnesses, presented no mitigating evidence, and offered no apology. Hasan admitted to the shooting and told the court he was acting to defend the Taliban from U.S. forces. He expressed no remorse, stating that he had switched sides in a conflict and did not regret his actions. The military panel, composed of senior officers, found Hasan guilty on all charges, including 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. He was sentenced to death, becoming the first U.S. military member in decades to receive the death penalty for a mass killing on a military base. Nidal Hasan is currently incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on military death row. Because military executions require presidential approval, no date has been set. His case remains under automatic appeal, though Hasan himself has stated he seeks martyrdom and does not wish to challenge his sentence. Now paralyzed from the waist down, Hasan uses a wheelchair and is under constant supervision. His prison writings have reiterated his allegiance to radical Islamist ideology. He has requested to be recognized as a citizen of the Islamic State, though no such request has been officially honored. Nidal Malik Hasan has made no final public statement since his conviction. The victims he gunned down included young soldiers preparing to serve, medical staff, and a pregnant woman. The survivors live with scars, many physical, many psychological. The Fort Hood shooting prompted significant changes to base security, counterintelligence screening, and insider threat protocols across all branches of the military. Yet the case remains controversial. Some have criticized the U.S. government for failing to detect and act on clear warning signs of radicalization. Others debate the classification of the attack as workplace violence, rather than an act of terrorism, a designation that affected the benefits available to victims and families. Hasan's name is now associated with betrayal, extremism, and ideological warfare from within. The deaths of 13 individuals and the injuries of 30 others serve as a haunting reminder of what happens when ideology overpowers duty, and when red flags go ignored. Abraham Thomas. State of execution: Kansas. In 1954, Private Abraham Thomas of the U.S. Army committed a brutal quadruple murder while stationed in Gersthofen, West Germany. Armed with a carbine, he shot and killed 2 fellow American soldiers and their German girlfriends. The attack was premeditated, and all 4 victims died at the scene. Thomas was arrested shortly after the killings. He did not resist arrest, and military authorities took immediate custody. The incident shocked both the American military community and local German residents. He was tried by a U.S. military court-martial in Augsburg, West Germany. The court found him guilty on 4 counts of premeditated murder. Despite a plea of insanity, Thomas was sentenced to death on April 15, 1954. Following sentencing, he was transferred to the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He remained on death row for over 4 years. His appeals were unsuccessful, and clemency was denied by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. On July 23, 1958, at 12:04 a.m., Abraham Thomas was hanged at Fort Leavenworth. He was one of the last U.S. soldiers executed by hanging. His final statement was one of gratitude to the prison commandant for the humane treatment he had received during incarceration. Army Private John Bennett. State of execution: Kansas. Between 1954 to 1955, Bennett committed a violent assault in Salzburg, Austria, while stationed there, using physical force to attack an 11-year-old girl. The attack initially appeared as a random act of violence, allowing the crime details to remain unclear initially. Authorities became suspicious after the victim survived the assault and provided a description of her attacker. The investigation was triggered by the victim's survival and eyewitness testimony. Key evidence included victim testimony and medical examinations. John Bennett was arrested in 1954. He denied guilt, stating it was a case of mistaken identity, and claimed confusion and emotional stress from overseas military duties. The jury didn't give in and charged him with rape and attempted murder. Key evidence presented in court included victim testimony, medical records, and circumstantial evidence. John Bennett was convicted of rape and attempted premeditated murder. He was sentenced to death by hanging, held at Fort Leavenworth Disciplinary Barracks. He was described by staff as quiet and cooperative. He requested spiritual support from a military chaplain. His last meal was not recorded. He spent his final hours with a military chaplain. On April 13, 1961, he was executed and pronounced dead at 10:06 a.m. His final words were, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." These are the stories of men sentenced to die. Military men whose crimes shook the system, whose fates hang in the balance, and whose silence still lingers on death row. Do you think justice delayed is justice denied, or do some men deserve to wait forever? Drop your thoughts below. If you believe stories like these should never be forgotten, subscribe to the channel. This is Sin, Crime, and Silence Records.